Good morning. It works. Fantastic. Good morning, everyone. Have you had a nice and good night of sleep? Yeah? Fantastic. Then I would just propose that we do one little exercise. I love exercises to just like wake up the brain. So let's just like get as tall as we can in our seats. And then we let it go. Yeah, that works, doesn't it? Fantastic. Welcome to this session on student-centered learning. It's an honor to be here. My name is Sandberg. I was Vice President of European Students' Union until last year when I left the student movement bubble, and then I'm back for today. Super excited to discuss student-centered learning, but not only from the perspective, and mainly not from the perspective of quality assurance, but rather from how to move from the theory into practice, and actually how to do it in everyday education. That is enough about me, I would say. We have two fantastic speakers with us, actually four, but you don't see that in the program. And I would like to, as so nicely, I had a discussion with one of the speakers yesterday, said, we're going to hear today about the why we need to move from the theory into practice, and we also will learn about how we do this. So first, I would like to welcome Professor Teun Dekker from Maastricht University, joined by his two students, Olga and Mattia. Thank you, welcome to the stage.
Thank you so much. Living is making choices. That is the human condition. Every day we, as human beings, make judgments. We come to conclusions about problems. We decide what we think and what we should do. We do this as workers in the economy, but we also do this as citizens in society. And we do this as people, as individuals. And the quality of those judgments and of those decisions determines the quality of our society and our lives. And so it's very important that higher education, and indeed education in general, teaches people how to make judgments well, how to decide and how to make choices. And so it might be interesting on this occasion to think a little bit about how you could make choices, what the mechanics of making choices are. And you can make choices in two ways. You can make a determinant judgment, or you can make a reflective judgment. I'm borrowing here from Kant, but steal from the best. That's my motto. Now, determinant judgment is a very simple kind of judgment. You take an existing system of rules, an existing way of looking at the world, and you apply it to the case at hand. So you ask, what do the rules say about this problem? And you implement that solution. But then there is reflective judgment, this other kind of judgment, where you don't ask, what do the rules say? But you ask, which system of rules that I could apply do I want to apply in this particular case? You see, there are many problems, many complex or wicked problems, where there isn't one system of rules that applies, but where there are different kinds of rules and different systems of knowledge that you can apply, which all give you a different answer. And each of these answers is, in some ways, better, and in some ways worse. Benefits some people, harms others. And in these cases, you cannot simply say, well, what do the rules say? But rather you have to decide what you think and which way of looking at the problem should prevail for you. Now, this kind of judgment is going to be very important in the future. It's always been important, but as we go into the 21st century, the big problems we face, the environment, climate change, questions of social justice, questions of how we should govern technology, they are all of this character. There are no rules that we can simply apply and be done with it. And this is going to become even more important in the economy, because of course the rise of artificial intelligence is upon us. And computers, artificial intelligence, are very good at making determinate judgment. They're fantastic about applying rules to cases. they're absolutely terrible at making reflective judgments because all they can do is apply rules, and that is exactly what you can't do in a reflective judgment. I'd add to that also democracy requires people who can think for themselves, who can trade off different values and make decisions based on what they think. Democracy does not live off people who simply ask, well, what do the rules say? That's not how democracy works. And so it is clear to me that in the future we need to have young people who are comfortable making reflective judgments. But unfortunately, a lot of higher education throughout Europe, throughout the European higher education area, is still very much about teaching people determinate judgment, teaching people how to memorize rules and how to apply those rules to particular cases. And this is really the model of judgment that is behind teacher-centered education. Because the traditional idea of the teacher as the expert, the person who knows the rules and who will teach the students the rules that they can use later on in life, that is a form of preparing people for determinate judgment, the not so useful kind of judgment. And that is why we have lectures. Expert stands in front of people, explains what the rules are. That is why the professors design the curriculum. They decide what you need to know to become an expert just like them. And that is why we have exams and forms of assessment that basically say, here's a problem, please tell me, what do the rules that we discussed say? And of course, multiple choice exams are fantastic at this. They are a fantastic way of testing whether or not you have internalized the rules. And so we have a need for reflective judgment in the future, but an education system that is still fundamentally about teaching determinate judgment. And that has to change. So how then do we help young people make these reflective judgments, these judgments where they cannot simply apply rules? Well, whenever you face a problem like that, you have to do three things. First of all, you have to ask yourself, well, what kinds of ways of looking at the problem are there? What rules could I apply? What solutions do various different perspectives give for this problem? Once you have a sense of the possible answers, you have to consider those answers. You have to ask yourself, well, what are their effects? How do they affect society in different ways? How do they affect different people in different ways? What are the values that are furthered and harmed if we implement that solution? And once you have a sense of that, you have to, and this is the hard part, you have to choose. You have to decide. You have to figure out, well, what am I going to do? And you cannot, in that decision, rely on the value, on the rules that are there. You have to rely on your own values, what you believe to be important, what you are willing to live with, and what you can explain to other people. Because that is the key thing. You have to decide based on the values that are yours and that are a reflection of who you are. And there's a beautiful circle here. Because while you can only make true decisions based on your values, you can only discover your values by making decisions. How do you know who you are? How do you know what you think is important? Well, you make a decision, you follow your gut, and then you reflect on what that says about you. You ask yourself, well, if this is what I choose, if this is what I think is important, what does that tell me about who I am? And so you decide based on your values, but you discover your values by deciding. And that means that if we want to teach young people, students, how to make these reflective judgments, we need to confront them with these hard questions. We need to ask them to look at problems from different perspectives. We need to ask them to think about the consequences of different solutions, of different ways of looking at those problems. And we have to ask them what they think, what they would do, what their answer to the question is, so that they can reflect on what their values are and discover what is important to them. And it seems to me that a student-centered way of learning is exactly the kind of education that will teach you that. Whereas teacher-centered education is fantastic for teaching you determinate judgment, it is student-centered education that can help you make reflective judgments and teach you how to be comfortable with these kinds of problems. Now, our next speaker, Manya, will explain in greater detail exactly how this works, but I think the essential idea is that you want to have an education that allows students to grapple with these hard questions, that allows students the freedom in education to ask and answer their own questions, to decide what problems matter for them, how they want to look at those problems, how they think about those problems. And that is really the great freedom that a student-centered education should provide. Freedom in what to study, freedom in how you study it, and most of all, an invitation not only to memorize rules, not only to become the expert that the teacher is, but to figure out what you think, what matters to you, and as a reflection of that, what your values are. Now, this is an abstract ideal. This is something that sounds great in a communique, but the hard part is to make it real. How do you take these values, these ideas, and implement them in a concrete educational setting? Well, one model that we can follow is the liberal arts and sciences model, because 20 years ago in this very city, the bachelor phase was created as the first cycle of higher education. And that made it possible to think a little bit more creatively about what the role of a bachelor is and to experiment a little bit with different modes of doing that. And many educational entrepreneurs, actually throughout Europe, in the Netherlands, but also in Central and Eastern Europe, now also in the UK and spreading gradually, have taken this freedom to reintroduce the model of liberal education for the 21st century. Small-scale programs that are really characterized by open curricula, which means that students have a great deal of freedom to design their own curriculum, to decide which courses matter for them. Programs that use a very active pedagogy, in which students are really in charge of the learning process. Students really are part of a community, an academic community with teachers where they relate as peers, as people who are engaged in a common educational enterprise in which research and deciding what you want to learn, how you want to learn it, and what you think about the issues at hand can be realized. And it seems to me that this kind of educational model, freedom of choice, small-scale academic community, is a very good way of teaching people how to make reflective judgments, how to figure out how to deal with problems that cannot be solved by simply applying the rules that were taught to you many years ago in a hot lecture hall. And to substantiate this claim, to prove, or at least to give some evidence that this liberal arts model is a fantastic way of learning how to make reflective judgments, I could give you some theory, or I can tell you what I think happens, but that perhaps would reflect my own fantasies and desires more than the reality. And that is why I figured it would be very helpful to also hear from some students. And that is why I'm delighted that I was able to convince Mattia and Olga, two students from my own institution, from University College of Maastricht, who have just finished the program. Right? They're just waiting for their theses to be graded, so be nice. To reflect a little bit on their own education and how that education prepared them to make the kinds of reflective judgments that they will have to make in their future, but also for our future.
All right, thank you very much, Teun. Good morning to everyone. Buongiorno a tutti. So I'm Mattia and this is Olga, and as Teun mentioned, we are here to give you some life experience that we experienced ourselves by studying the liberal arts and sciences program and by engaging in student-centered learning. So specifically pertaining to these three aspects that Teun mentioned, which is that we have the freedom of what we study, how to study, and then also it helps us basically discover our own values and how we think and how we assess problems in the real world. So as for the first one, how to study, as Teun mentioned, we have an open curriculum. So this means that every step of the way, we get to decide ourselves what we want to study. And this creates a great sense of responsibility because we are the ones that have to decide ourselves what we study. And this also creates a lot of awareness in a way because we are very much aware of the different disciplines that are out there and the different perspectives that are out there in analyzing a problem. We don't only look at problems through only one perspective, for example, let's say economics. But we look at the different disciplines and have to make choices and decide which disciplines we engage in. So one example was also my thesis that I just handed in 2 weeks ago, in which I analyzed a big Chinese infrastructural project, which often in the media and also in academic literature is only analyzed through an economic dimension. But because I had an open curriculum and was able to look at different disciplines and different perspectives, I was able to look at this problem also through different perspectives and see that this big Chinese infrastructural project does not only have economic repercussions, but also political ones, societal ones, and even environmental ones. So we see here that through student-centered learning, I was able to grasp the full complexity of the problem and then also analyze it more adequately.
For me, the open curriculum gave me a lot of choice to pick from a wide array of courses offered at UCM, and this fostered an awareness about the choices that I make and the impact they have on my life path. So upon starting my UCM career, I was convinced that I want to study international relations. After a few months, I took a few courses and I realized that the field is a little bit too broad for me. The explanations it offers about the world are a little bit too general for what I find important and the questions that I wanted to be answered about the world. Having the chance to experiment a bit, I ended up in the field of sociology and realized that that's more reflective of my values. After a year of taking courses in this field, I ended up in microsociology, and I specialized in identity studies because I realized that what I care about and what is important for me are the stories that people tell us and what we can infer about our society from those stories. So in this way, none of this would actually be possible without having the freedom to pick and experiment and be able to change your mind about your academic path and the field that you identify with, and only afterwards make an actual informed decision. So in this sense, the open curriculum offered me the chance not only to articulate my academic interest, but also really find my worldview and what I find important for me and what is valuable in my opinion. The second point that Teun mentioned concerned the ways in which you study at the Liberal Arts and Sciences program. And of course, an important dimension of that is the fact that we as students have a lot of agency in shaping our own learning process by answering the questions that we ourselves pose in the tutorial setting, and also by being able to pick the study materials that would answer those questions. So in my experience, in multiple instances at University College Maastricht, where I conducted research, I decided to go the extra mile, and instead of looking at secondary literature, I decided to conduct research by going out there in the field and find my own participants, ask my own questions, and conduct my own field work. And by being able to have a direct interaction with my participants, I firstly, of course, gained a sense of how it is to conduct my own research, but also I had the chance to actively engage with the society on issues that matter for me, on issues that I care about, rather than passively relying on secondary sources or just following a rule book. So in this sense, the way we learn at our university college empowered me to actively take charge of my own learning process. Yeah, and I was able also, when I went on my exchange semester to East Asia,
I was able to really contrast this student-centered learning approach that both Teun and Olga have now talked about when it comes to how to study, with the more, let's say, traditional forms of education in a big lecture hall of over 500 students, because when I went to East Asia, this was the educational setting. And I really noticed that when it was there, so when it was more, let's say, teacher-centered learning, where you would just listen to a lecturer and follow his or her rule book, this really had many repercussions. So firstly, I noticed that between me and my peers that were also sitting in this big lecture hall, I actually tried to engage with the teacher, ask questions, engage in critical thinking, whereas most students that were just sitting in a lecture hall were just passively following, let's say, the rule book of the lecturer. And by me asking questions, asking critical questions, engaging with what the lecturer was saying, that created for a much more dynamic classroom, and also many new perspectives that came into that classroom. And in addition, what I also really noticed in juxtaposition with what I study in Maastricht at UCM and what I learned in East Asia is that I was able to remember much more of what I've been studying in Maastricht, because there I'm able to answer my own questions that I posed and also engage with the study materials in a much more active sense. Whereas in East Asia, I was engaging with the study materials very passively, and that resulted in me not remembering much of what I learned because it was a very passive sense of learning. So I see that through student-centered education, I'm able to remember much more of what I'm learning rather than teacher-centered education.
Okay, so lastly, the third point concerned about the ways in which we assess our liberal arts and sciences education and the impact of the reflective judgments make there on the society. So by practicing decision-making in so many instances on what we study, on how we study, we as students have this space to find what is important for us, to construct certain beliefs and deconstruct previous assumptions, and ultimately we have the space to articulate our values and transpose them into the real world, into solving the problems and making decisions into the society.
Right. So let me just give you an example of how I basically applied this reflective judgment into a real-life example that I experienced myself, a very practical one, but I think it clearly brings home the point, so to say. So I live in Amsterdam. I grew up in Amsterdam, and that is, as you might know, a biking city where everybody bikes. So I, every day, also was always on my bike, biking in the city center. But I was always very, very frustrated with all the motor vehicles that were on the bicycle path. And sometimes also my more emotive Italian side came out, and I engaged in road rage, so to say. But basically through reflective judgment, through having to make decisions in my education, so what I study, how I study, I was able to more critically assess this whole problem of, let's say, motorized vehicles on the bicycle path. And I was basically able to challenge my assumptions. Well, why do I think motorized vehicles do not belong on the bicycle paths? Why do I think that the center of the city should only be for bikes or should be a car-free city center? And I started asking myself the question, well, who are these people that come on their motorized vehicles into the city center? Well, perhaps these are people that usually maybe come from the outskirts. Well, then who are people that usually live in the outskirts? Perhaps these are people that come from a lower socioeconomic background. And then I started asking myself the question, well, do we want to keep the city center accessible to all, right? Because if we create a car-free or a motorized vehicle-free city center, perhaps we're unable to give access to these people that live in the outskirts. So basically through that reflective judgment, I was able to reassess my assumptions and also reassess my values, and then actually come to the decision, well, perhaps it is okay for these motorized vehicles to come in the city center, and I just have to share the space as a biker with these other individuals. So what you basically see here is that through my education, my student-centered education, I was really able to think more critically and think about what are the different perspectives out there, right? And then basically through that also discover, okay, what are my values? What is the way off? Do I want a car-free city center? But by that, I also hamper access to people from the outskirts, and then basically come to a much more balanced and informed decision. So this was basically the examples that we gave you, just to give an insight into what for us in the past 3 years student-centered learning has been all about. And we'll hand it over to Teun to wrap it up.
The idea that higher education is fundamentally about learning the rules, about internalizing the systems that have been made by experts and applying them later on in your job, is a very strange one. Because I think on some level we all agree that that is not what we want from our universities, and that is not what we want from our university graduates. And yet, it's a bit of a zombie idea because it refuses to die. I am struck by how often when we talk about education, we still seem to have this teacher-centered model in our heads in many cases. But let me tell you, this idea of education has no future, if only because everything that you need to make determinate judgment is out there on the internet. The lectures are better on YouTube. You can get the books by yourself. Companies are assessing students in very organized ways that they don't really need degrees for. And so if universities still think of themselves as teaching determinate judgment, teaching people how to follow rules, they have no future. And that really is the challenge for the next 20 years of the Bologna process. The first 20 years have been about fundamentals, about credit transfer systems and common bachelor degrees and degree recognition and all that, and gee, that's important. But now we have to build on those fundamentals and create an education system that prepares people for the future that we want, that teaches people, young people, how to make reflective judgments based on values that are their own and that are deeply held. And it is that challenge that we need to implement, and not on a grand level. It's easy to say these things in beautiful lecture halls at glamorous conferences, but rather to make that a reality, not just for a few students here or there, for example in liberal arts programs, but throughout the higher education system. Because, as I'm often reminded, having just the vision is no solution. Everything depends on execution. The art of education is putting it together.